At this point, it is a life goal of mine to actually be able to post on time and frequently. It's a New Year's resolution. What is up, muchachos and muchachas? I'm Ava. If you want to know more about me and my channel, if you're new, check out my All About Homegrown Faith video. And if you're not, so good to see you again after a short break. I'm so happy that we're gonna finally be diving into some good stuff today. I mean, my other videos are good stuff too, but this one, these are the commandments, as you've seen by the title of the video. So I'm going to share with you a few things before I dive into the video, because this has just got a lot to talk about. So the first one is my whole thought process behind creating these videos, and I realized that before we try and dive into like profound topics, we need to focus on the basics and completely understanding the basics, and then we can move forward. Second, the purpose of these videos is to point us all back to the Creator. It's not to ostracize anyone or to make anyone feel bad, but it's only to either convict you through the help of the Holy Spirit or point you back to Jesus, because literally everybody needs Jesus. Like, there's no beating around the bush with that. Third, viewer discretion is advised. There are some hard topics and some controversial things, and so just keep that in mind. I mean, I really don't think anyone's going to be too shocked about it because it's pretty much normalized, but still, viewer discretion is advised. Just take that into mind and let's get into it. The 10 Commandments. We've all heard of them, we all know them. They're usually on a little portrait on the wall that's dumbed down so we children can understand them, or they're painted on the walls of Christian churches. Either way, we've seen them. The point is, do we actually understand it? Well, first, off the bat, I want to point out something. The commandments aren't suggestions. It's literally in the word commandment. Command. It's the entire Bible isn't a suggestion. Now you can choose whether or not you want to read the Bible and you want to actually be saved, or you can choose not. We're given that free choice. So now, the very first command. You shall have no other gods before me. Well, lucky for you, I did probably like a week's worth of research. So I gathered up a few ingredients to make this video, one of them being practically a history research paper, which was interesting to say the least. And then we're going to be talking about different forms of idols that we have, what they mean, how we still sacrifice to some of those Old Testament idols today. And then we're also going to be talking about a very controversial idea. Maybe not controversial for some people, but probably for most, it's definitely going to be a little uneasy. And sometimes it's even outright blasphemous. So we're going to be talking about that towards the very end. But then, kind of lighten everything up, I'm going to talk about the difference between worshiping God and idol worship. So first things first, what is an idol or a god? Not the God, but a god. Lowercase g. So this is something that we forsake God with. It's whatever we run to for comfort, for pleasure, for anything, really, if we don't run to God first. Now, these different idols can be, sin is probably the biggest one, but it can be people, it can be doctrines, it can be hobbies, sports, whatever. It can pretty much be almost anything within context. But now the biggest thing is God tells us to turn from these idols and to not forsake him with these idols and to go to him. We're called, just like Israel was, to be separated, to be made apart from the world. Because even though we are in the world, we are not of the world. And I talk about idolatry so much because it is such a subtle sin that will grapple and put people in a chokehold, and people don't even know they have it. It's such a serious sin. I was enslaved to it for years before I even had any idea what I was doing. And this is the first commandment. But looking back in the Old Testament, and even really in the entire Bible, but I'm going to be focusing on the Old Testament, we see that Israel falls so many times to the worship of idols. Now, why is this? Well, the biggest reason is polytheism and monotheism. History of idolatry. So this dates back to Exodus 12:12, when this was the first mention of other gods. Now, mind you, the book of Exodus is roughly 3,000 years old according to Princeton University Press. Now, I'm going to bring up a point. Israel, for a very, very, very long time, was heavily influenced by other visible gods around them. It was something tangible that they could see and that they could feel, and they could physically see other people worshiping and then seeing the outcomes of the worship of others. So when they were told to only serve one invisible God, it was rough, because they had lived their entire life in Egypt, where we all know that Egyptian mythology centers around many, many, many gods. So for them, it was essentially taking away part of their culture and the things that they were around with so much. And mind you, after Moses was bringing the Israelites out of Egypt and bringing them to the Promised Land, they went back to the golden calf. So when they were told to only serve one God they couldn't physically see, because again, John 4 verse 24 says that God is spirit. So you can't see spirit, really. So that's why they went back to the golden calf, because it was physical. It was something that they could derive comfort from. It was something that they had practically grown up with. And this is actually symbolism for us. Egypt, our own Egypt, was whatever sin we were in bondage to. And coming out is obviously a journey. Coming out of the bondage of sin and of becoming a new creation in Christ is a journey. We are made new when we accept Jesus, but it's obviously still a journey, because habits and people you're surrounding yourself with. So it's something that you have to do every day. Just like the Israelites had to walk every day to get to their promised land, that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking our trek and our journey to our promised land, essentially heaven. So the Israelites figured that they could just add another god to their list and then anything would be granted. Israel had to learn to reject polytheism for monotheism. This was a constant battle throughout the entire Bible, especially when the Israelites were heavily influenced by other nations. This was why God told them to kill everyone. Pause. I can already hear the people who reject God and say that, the Bible is fallible, just running and saying, see, who would want to serve a God who has everyone destroyed? Yeah, I'm gonna break that down, because it's a genuine question. I even had that question. I was like, why would God want them to kill innocent people? Why would God want anyone to kill anyone? This is thou shalt not murder, right? Yeah, but just listen to this. Well, let's look at Deuteronomy 20 verse 18. Their practice would destroy Israel. To the closed-off or unbelieving mind, one would assume that God is ruthless. But in reality, the neighboring nations have heard of God yet still rejected him. How? Well, let's look at Joshua 2 verses 8 through 11. They have all heard about the parting of the Red Sea before anyone killed anyone. They got warnings but still shunned God. Even in the New Testament, there's still warnings. Romans 1 verse 21 through 24 still shows that many know of God but still turn from him to be with their sin. And as for children, we find that answer in the second commandment, Exodus 20 verse 5. Now I'm going to bring in a quote from Mark Bollinger at applygodsword.com. Essentially, idolatry is a generational sin. Anyone left would corrupt God's chosen people, ignorant or not, unless they repented. The next question is, what happens when the Israelites chose to ignore God and let idolatry influence them, either through foreign wives or people who were told to die but were kept alive, mostly through the spoils of war? Well, let's talk about the foreign gods of the Old Testament. Now, I'm only going to include a few prominent ones because we do not have all the time in the world, and I do not have all the brain capacity to take in every single god mentioned throughout the Bible. So I'm going to be naming the most prominent ones that we see. The first one, we're going to go to Judges 10 verse 6. Baals. I don't know how to pronounce it entirely, but still, you get the point. So this god was originally from Canaan, but was influenced by foreign wives to the Israelites. Ahab and Jezebel, Solomon and his 700 wives or so, and other people of Israel. Now, this name was often used as a generic term for God. Baal also had a specific purpose. So he was seen as a god of fertility and a storm god, and this also heavily influenced crops and their food, really. Now, why was Baal so important? Well, according to Britannica, tablets discovered in 1929 in northern Syria, specifically Ras Shamra, tells the tale of why Baal was important. Baal and Mot, god of death and sterility, would fight for a 7-year victory, and whether crops would flourish for those 7 years. If Baal won, well, crops were good, but if Mot won, there was a famine. So to worship him, most of these required sacrifices. Now usually they were animals or crops or the first fruits, but rare times there were human sacrifices, just like with most gods. And then in 1 Kings 18 verse 28, in the battle between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, we see that harming yourself was also custom, making yourself bleed in front of this foreign pagan god. Worship also included orgies and other perverse ideas, since it was a god of fertility, and it also heavily relied on temple prostitutes. Now Baal was also seen in other cultures as a god of marriage. And continuing, we meet Ashtoreth. Now this is according to compellingtruth.org. She was originally from the Phoenicians, primarily a Canaanite and Philistine goddess, but also went by Asherah, hence the Asherah poles, since her worship was often in the forest. She was the goddess of the moon, but different cultures changed her up a bit. Mostly, she was seen as a goddess of fertility, sexual love, and war, and could even be another form or distinctly related to Ishtar. More on that later. When worshipping, people would commit sacrifices, cutting, and even sexual perversion, but the Canaanites specifically poured out libations in her name and burned offerings. I always think it's interesting how many other gods or deities or prophets or whatever change depending on the culture. Like, nothing's ever the same. This to me just further proves that the Lord really is the one and true God, because he remains the same. He has not changed from the day of creation until right at this very moment. And then going down to Judges 16 verse 23, Dagon. Now according to Bible study tools, Dagon or Dagon was associated to Baal, being his father, hence one of the oldest gods in the Mesopotamian culture. Even though he's often depicted as a half-man, fish, bearded guy thing, his main area of expertise dealt with crops and anointing kings and victory. Scholars argue that even though he was a fish man thing, that was likely due to the Philistines. They lived on the coast. In reality, Dagon's name was even associated to an old noun for grain. Now, worshipping Dagon was mostly through sacrifices, human or animals, and feasts, parties basically, or revelries. And then 1 Kings 11 verse 7, Chemosh. Now New World Encyclopedia tells us that he was essentially the Almighty, at least to the Moabites. Now this is what gets me. While it is hard to know what he did specifically, from the Moabite stone or Mesha steel, Chemosh is further seen as an all-knowing divine being who you could contact through most likely divination, prediction, or prophecy. Molech, the Canaanite god, was ruthless, let me just tell you that. So, your discretion is advised. And this is also based off of 1 Kings 11 verse 7. Now, while most gods dealt with child sacrifices, this one was solely based off of the sacrificing of children. To describe the different purposes of Molech, the little holes or the little indentations in the center of the statue are for ox, birds, sheep, stuff like that. But the hands were specifically for children, because child sacrifices was the highest, meaning it was the most favorable according to the eyes of Molech. During the sacrifice, the priest would bang on the ceremonial drums to drown out the screams of the child. Now, of course, the biggest question is, why would anyone want to do this? And why would anyone want to sacrifice their child? the whole purpose was to secure the child's future. Conniving priests convinced anyone who didn't participate would lose their children to death. But apparently, most children actually did survive, but were terribly scarred, emotional and physical, and had massive trauma on their bodies and mental trauma. But there were a few children who were left on too long and actually were burned alive. I'm gonna leave it at that. Yeah. The next one is in Jeremiah 7 verse 18, and this is when we are introduced to Ishtar, the queen of heaven. Now she was worshipped by the ancient Mesopotamian peoples. Ishtar was considered the highest female deity or a mother goddess in some other versions. She essentially takes the role of many different aspects of human life, such as fertility, life, and war. But she was most famous for being centered around love and sexuality, hence her many, many rumored lovers. To worship her included engaging in sacred prostitution. Warning, this is gonna get controversial, but just food for thought. Could we still be sacrificing or worshiping these pagan foreign idols to this day? Could we be worshiping them under the name of love is love, sexual freedom, a woman's right to choose? Now, I am thoroughly convinced that these gods aren't actually pieces of wood or silver, but they're actually principalities or demons that might mold and change to fit the standard of society, thus feeding off of power given to them and evolving into more powerful spirits. Now, of course, the biggest question is, what do you mean? Well, great question. In regards to Molech and a woman's right to choose, ancient historical parents would choose to sacrifice their babies to secure their future. In the same sense, modern women and men believe that, whether it is to terminate a pregnancy due to a disability in the child, a career goal, or even the sin of the father, or more specifically, rape. And then we know that the spirit of Baal runs rampant. He was the most prominent form of idolatry. And as for sexual freedom and love is love, the majority of these gods fed off of perversion, orgies, and worse. And these are just thoughts. Now switching gears, let's talk about some specific idols. I'll name a few, then I'll finish this topic with a serious, even blasphemous idol we may have fallen into. So the first one is, we've all heard that the love of money is the root of all evil. But do you know why? In Colossians 3 verse 5 and 6, greed, or covetousness, which is also a commandment, more on that later, causes people to destroy, kill, and lie. Now this greed can come from the love of money, which is the most common, influence, or power. And the second is people. Now these can be preachers, or people we know, or even people we're in a relationship with. Now pastors are given a flock, but it's up to them to teach the right way. Oftentimes pastors try and multiply their church or their specific income or even their fame with faulty doctrine. Most specifically, the prosperity gospel, word of faith, new age movement, and more. What do these teach? Striking Gnostic-like ideas. Happiness, wealth, and health is salvation, and spiritualism or astrology. Now, as for a relationship, it's when a person puts the other before God, or even when they entirely devote themselves to another person outside of marriage. Number 3, hobbies or desires. Now don't get me wrong, it is good to have goals and dreams and things to do to relax. But it's different when it consumes you. When you spend your entire life revolving around that one thing, and that one thing is your comfort, or it's something that you go to when you're stressed. And the funny thing is that we're actually told how to get the desires of our hearts. The God-given desires, not lust and wickedness. I'm talking about the God-given desires for like marriage or godly influence or a community, dreams that are part of the gifts that God gave you. We're told how to get all of these things. It's literally in the Bible. Matthew 6 verse 33. Seek the kingdom first, and then all else shall be given to you. And number 4, one of the most hidden ones, is self-worship. I could make an entire video about this. This is so prominent in our vain culture. We're all focused on ourselves. Okay, again, it's good to have some like me time, you know, like time where I do self-care or whatever. But that's not what life's about. It's about sacrificial love. We can't be so focused on ourselves that we ignore people in need around us. And I oh man, I caught myself doing that several times. I caught myself like focusing on what I wanted, what was good for me, what would benefit me, and I didn't help anyone. Like, y'all, this is legit. This is such a prominent worship in our society. We're so focused on the likes we get, the amount of followers we have. And I had to learn real quick that this is not what matters. What matters is what I'm saying. Is what I'm saying true. Is what I'm saying glorifying God. Is what I'm saying turning people back to God. And the same thing, even if you don't have a platform, it's about, what are my actions doing? Are my actions only glorifying myself and what I want, or are they helping other people? For a while, I was actually confused about this one because I thought, well, everyone has to eat. Well, it's not like that. The definition from Oxford Languages actually says that gluttony is habitual greed or an excess in eating. What's actually interesting about this is gluttony doesn't even have to do with food. I mean, it does, but also it can be with greed and with overindulgence in greed. Now, the reason why gluttony is so important in this case is because it shows a lack of self-control. Sometimes binge eating and overeating can be seen as a coping mechanism. It's when we turn to food before God. Food in itself isn't bad. Food is good. Let's be real. Food is amazing. It's when our stomach become God's. Gluttony and greed go hand in hand. That's why we always have to demonstrate self-control and humility. If this was a degree you got at school, I would have whatever is above a PhD. I can't tell you how many times I literally got stomach aches for stressing over the thoughts and opinions of others that literally did not even matter. Now, the thing about this is that compromise and people-pleasing go hand in hand. This was a hard truth that I had to learn. And I'll even tell you this from my own experience. When you people-please and when you make people-pleasing your entire personality, at the end of the day, you don't even know who you really are because your personality and who you are changes from each set of people you're around with. And I literally had to learn this the hard way. I will tell you this now, you can't be afraid of what people are going to say and think, because in the end, some people are just not going to like you because you're a follower of Christ. People-pleasing often forces people to compromise their set of beliefs and their moral values and even what they believe as being Christians. People-pleasing is also a form of insecurity. It's wanting so desperately to fit in and to be liked that you are willing to risk your own self in order to be a person that everybody wants to see. I could seriously go into so much more detail and depth about this because it is such a prominent and often overlooked problem that we as Christians face to this day. But I'm telling you this because I literally lived through it, and it's a warning. Don't do it. Just seriously don't. I'm gonna include this quote from Paul Washer. If you don't know who that is, in my last video, I showed a clip of him. He's actually a pretty good pastor that I like, and I like to listen to because he spits out facts, man. Time to get even more controversial. If we don't read the Bible, how can we know our Creator? How can we know the characteristics and nature of God? If we don't read the Bible, then we can't know how the heavens declare the glory of God in Psalm 19 verse 1. If we don't read the Bible, then we can't know who to run to if ruin threatens to overtake us, or who our refuge is. The point is, if you don't read the Bible, if you don't have a healthy prayer life, it's hard to understand who God is. So many find themselves formulating this idea of God based off of man. A prime example of this is the assumption of God's gender.
Good morning, the holy and queer one be with you.
Not even 5 seconds in and I already want a refund.
My name is Caroline Camp. I use she, they pronouns. I am the communications coordinator. Thank you all for being here at the first ever Divinity Pride worship collaboration. We want to affirm everyone to be who they truly are, to step into the Holy One's fire that burns away all that says we are not good enough and refines us by the Pentecostal fire to be who exactly the great queer one calls us to be. Let the Spirit move you today. Lift your hands and your voices and dance in whatever way is most freeing for you.
She can still twerk for the Lord. Give God a praise.
And pray with me the words found in your bulletin and on the screen. Strange one, fabulous one, fluid and ever becoming one, do not allow us to make our ideas of you into an idol. You are as close to us as our own breath, and yet your essence transcends all that we can imagine. You are mother, father, and parent. You are sister, brother, and sibling. You are drag queen and trans man and gender fluid, incapable of limiting your vast expressions of beauty. Embodied in us, your creation, we recognize our flesh in all its forms is made holy in you.
In John 4, verse 24, we learn that God is a spirit. Even though he's a spirit, throughout the entire Bible, God is referred to as male with masculine pronouns. He chose to be revealed as such. So to assume anything extra would be adding to God or even making a completely different God than the God that's in the Bible, especially in regards to leaving the impending judgment on humanity from God. God is revealed as a male. That's how he chose to be revealed. There is arguments that God could be above gender, and in our limited human knowledge, all we know is that God revealed himself as male. Time to finish up. This is the first commandment. The way to know God is to know the character of him, to read the Bible. And a good rule of thumb is to know the difference of idol worship and worshiping God. Now, the difference is that idol worship revolves around self. It's self-seeking, self-serving, willful disobedience, vain, worldly gain, and focused on comfort and entertainment. But seeking, serving, and worshiping God is all about transformation. It's centered on humility, because that humility follows his laws. It's obedience, it's transformation, it's purifying, it's selfless, it's a renewal. So here's my question for you. Who are you serving? The Lord, yourself, or an idol? I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I hope you got something good out of it. It made you realize something. I hope that the Spirit convicts you, and I pray that you just grow closer and closer to God with every step that you take to pursue him. Now please, you know the drill, like, share, and subscribe, and turn on the bell notifications for the occasional time I will post a video. Now, as always, I would love to hear what you have to say, anything you learn, anything you want to talk about in the comments, and have a great day. Do something nice for someone, and God bless.